I don't care about ordinals.
Really?
I mean,
You should.
No, I don't care. I don't care as in I don't care if people do it, and I don't care if people hate it. I've got a very simple view. Block space is there to be bought or sold, and if you're not breaking consensus, you have done nothing wrong. If you've got an issue with ordinals, you're not going to stop it by shouting at people. It's a bit like, I can't think of a good analogy, but if you don't like it, propose a BIP and see if it gets through. I don't think it will, so accept this new reality.
Well, that's a very common sense view. I wish more people had that view.
But I'm not too keen on the whole trolling people with it. I think it's a really interesting point where it says, I'm like Bitcoin, so I'm trying to break it. And this, how it's exposed problems with Lightning, I think is super important. I think we've benefited from it. Better to find out now than later down the line. I think dressing up as a wizard and dancing on stage, it feels very Ethereum.
And to be clear, their dances, they just didn't execute the dance movement very well.
They weren't even in time.
They weren't in time. Udi didn't know the flossing dance.
I can't do it. I've tried.
I can't do it either, but I didn't attempt it on stage.
Can you do it?
I've never tried it. I'm very proud to say I've never tried
It's surprising. Well, I've got
It's
a
actually
daughter.
pretty hard.
Yeah.
They picked a hard dance. They should have picked an easier one.
Look, he's doing it.
See,
Let's do it.
that's actually really good.
We haven't got a camera on him. Con, you need to come to the camera and do it. So, yes, I don't mind. I don't think Giacomo shouting at Udi online and calling him a scammer is going to make any difference. If anything, it's going to egg him on. He's going to enjoy it.
That's what he wants.
Yeah, totally.
That's what he wants.
So I accept this new reality. I haven't bought them. I don't have any need for them. I think ultimately people will lose money, but...
It does affect you as a Bitcoiner, though, because it changes the nature of Bitcoin. So it creates a new regime for fees, for better or for worse. I'm on the side of fees being good.
Yeah.
So structurally new regime, it congests block space, and now it costs more. For a long time, Bitcoin was 1 sat per byte. In my opinion, that's too low, right? So it's good for the long-term security, in my opinion. It creates a new pressure to take transactions off the main chain and use L2s, whether it's Lightning or something else. And it injects new developers into Bitcoin and new startups. So it adds vibrancy to the ecosystem. So even if you don't care about JPEGs one way or the other, it actually does change the nature of Bitcoin.
It does. And so the reality is, if you really don't like it, you have to propose a BIP and have to get it changed.
It's very difficult.
Yeah.
So Andrew Poelstra, who's not on Twitter, he was one of the architects of Taproot. He had, I don't know where he actually made this point, some non-Twitter domain, I don't know where. He said, there's no easy way to bar the insertion of arbitrary data into Bitcoin. And if you do it, if you reverse Taproot and you make it harder to inject data into Bitcoin, people have the bug for it now. They want to do it, right? They'll find a way to do it. It'll be less efficient. Maybe you can insert data in public keys, for instance, like kind of garbled public keys. Historically, people inserted data in op return, right? So there's no easy way to just selectively eliminate inscriptions from Bitcoin. People will find another way to do it, so there'll always be this congestion issue kind of like from now on.
Right. And you probably understand this better than me, but my expectation is, there's been a long debate over the fee market, and as the block reward drops, will there be enough to provide enough security? And I know there's how much is enough security, but bear with me. And one of the things that people have theorized is that, look, a couple of decades down the line, so many people would be using Bitcoin. It will be the settlement layer. It will be expensive to use. Let's not worry about it. So if that does happen, and if fees are very high for settling on Bitcoin, it would be very, very expensive to put ordinals within the block. So eventually, ordinals might get priced out of layer one anyway.
That's correct. So high prices are the cure for high prices, right? Yeah. So if you think about other commodities, oil. If oil gets really expensive, new oil wells come online, and that creates new supply, and that that brings back down the price of oil. Bitcoin's not exactly like that, but if Bitcoin block space gets very expensive, people that are inserting JPEGs, which is a very inefficient way to insert image data into Bitcoin, they'll find ways to compress the data, right? So there's ways to do it with code. So instead of putting pixel data into Bitcoin, you could compress an image into a few lines of code, right? So that's the idea of like a generative NFT. So where we are now is in a transition phase where people are still really inefficiently bundling as much image data into Bitcoin as possible. Once fees rise, people will want to increase the semantic density of block space and just be far more efficient in terms of how they're embedding data into the blockchain. So it's not something I worry about at all. And it's the same with monetary transactions. If fees rise, maybe it doesn't make sense to do a $5 transaction in Bitcoin, but then you will use a deferred settlement mechanism like Lightning, where, of course, many transactions are associated with one on-chain settlement. So I don't worry about fees at all.
No.
And I have seen a lot of discourse like, oh, fees are too high. Too high is a normative. You're imposing a normative lens on what is a market system. If you believe that Bitcoin should be an open and permissionless system, there's no such thing as too high. You could say it's too high for the global south, but that's just unfortunately the nature of the system, right? We can't impose a mandate. We can't impose a designated pricing on the commodity. It's like saying the price of oil is too high, and the working class, they can't afford their rides to work or whatever. That's unfortunate if the price of oil goes too high, but there's nobody that can set the price. And it's the same with Bitcoin block space. Nobody can set the price. We just have to accept the market price and tune our usage of the protocol accordingly. So if it is too high, then we use Lightning. We use other L2s.
And I don't think this is like the block size wars. Some people have compared it to like another civil war, but the block size wars was very different in that we were heading towards a chain split. This is like a very serious question about, was this the right thing for Bitcoin? And there were two very distinct camps. Whereas there is no outcome here where something's split in. It is just a use case. So I've been comparing it almost to it's like a Bitcoin culture war we're going through now.
Totally.
And I'm okay with the fact that it, like if we class it as that, but with it being a Bitcoin culture war, it's almost those fighting aren't changing anything by fighting, and some of it's a net negative.
Yeah,
there's no winners. I don't think there's any winners in culture wars. We can see that right now, the culture war we're in. Well,
it was a necessary conflict that was going to happen. I think it has actually been going on for much longer than people think.
Of course.
So there have been debates around whether it's okay to insert arbitrary data in Bitcoin, sort of non-economic data, from the beginning, right? So back in the day, there was this protocol called Counterparty, which was mediating asset issuance. And back then, there's always been this view among a certain faction of Bitcoiners, well, it's risky to have things that aren't Bitcoin being circulated on Bitcoin. Bitcoin should be trading just units of Bitcoin. And Counterparty was proposing an asset transmission protocol. And there was a way to do a multisig for Counterparty. And it was rendered non-standard, actually. So there's probably some controversy around this, but I believe it was actually Luke Dash that rendered multi-sig transactions for counterparty assets non-standard. That doesn't mean they were barred by the protocol. It just means that if you send the transaction into the network, it won't propagate. So you'd have to go to a miner directly to mine it.
Right.
And so that was back in 2013, I believe. And that actually did help kill off counterparty usage on Bitcoin.
They can't do the same now.
So, I think it'd be difficult for any developer to get a change like that through today. So, but that's just an example showing there has been this conflict between developers and users historically over whether it's acceptable to transmit non-Bitcoin related data on Bitcoin. And this is just a continuation of that. And in fact, Luke Dash has been vocal on the Ordinals debate this time. Again, he's actually been fairly consistent on that. So for as long as Bitcoin has existed, practically there's been a debate over how much data should be an op return. Should it be 40 bytes or 80 bytes? Is it too much to have 80 bytes in op return? This is just the same debate, but on a much bigger scale, because now potentially we have blocks that are all arbitrary data, and that's perceived as excluding sort of regular transactions.
So it kind of it causes another change as well. And that when people say to me, like, what is Bitcoin? I'm always quite simple about it. Bitcoin's just money. But the protocol actually now is more than just money. It's a market for data. It's a protocol for data.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't want to explain this to people. It is that, but essentially it is.
the thing is that we can't control what people do with it. You
Yeah.
know, so Satoshi put some non-financial information in the first block,
Yeah.
right? Early users of Bitcoin put, like, if you remember, there's an ASCII Bernanke. I think that was inserted in 2011 into Bitcoin. I think that was through arbitrary data insertion in addresses, and people have been using op return to put data into Bitcoin for the whole history of Bitcoin. So as an open protocol without rules on like who can use it or for what, and as a database that's highly available and has very strong assurances that that data is always going to be there, of course people are going to use it for non-money type transactions. That's just the nature of the system.
But a lot more so now. There's
Certainly now more, but we're still operating within the protocol rules. We're still bound by this 4 megabyte limit. I mean, obviously the rule changed in 2017 with SegWit, but we're still bound by that limit. So we are still operating within the sort of like actual protocol rule set. It's just that there's a new economic motive to put arbitrary data into Bitcoin. So it has changed in magnitude.
I do think there is a potential future block size argument if these ordinals continue to be used and successful. But as we said earlier, more people using Bitcoin for the transfer of money and settlement, then it becomes expensive. People who are big proponents of ordinals being priced out might be like, well, I think we maybe want to look at a block size increase to make this more affordable. I think that potential argument comes again down the line.
I think the ordinals people would be smart to understand that we need to start compressing the data. There is one valid point, which I would say is that ordinals or inscriptions are kind of subsidized in a way by the protocol because the witness, you pay less in fees, right, than the transaction data. And this is in the witness part of the block. So that
I think you should explain that whole thing.
I believe this change came into effect around the time of segregated witness in 2017. And if I'm not getting it wrong, the idea was to encourage people to make SegWit transactions and to make it cheaper from a fee perspective to have this witness data. And so because inscriptions are going in the witness, it's kind of cheaper in Bitcoin terms to insert that data. You could say maybe that was a mistake back then because now it's somewhat cheaper to put arbitrary data into Bitcoin than it is to put transaction data into Bitcoin. So that's probably the one sort of like valid point that I would say the anti-inscriptions people have.
So the people anti-inscriptions, are they, like I say, I'm on that I don't care, but actually I think there's more arguments to make me care that I've heard than I don't care. My fear stuff is more about I've spent all this time, last 6 years, talking to people about Bitcoin as money. It's the best form of money. And then there's this curveball that's come in. So I have to deal with that. And I kind of just want to focus on the money bit. But at the same time, like you said, you've just done now, you've given me a very good argument for why ordinals are good. And
well, I think it makes Bitcoin better at being money, right?
Yes.
So it increases the long-term fee revenue, which increases the long-term security of the protocol, which we totally need. I don't know what the correct amount of security spend is. Maybe there's no correct amount, but I think it's ought to be higher if the system is mediating a lot of value transfer. We need miners to be incentivized to do their job. So kind of on a second order basis, I think inscriptions make Bitcoin more secure from a monetary perspective. And they also create this pressure to do layered scaling, right? Because if fees get really expensive, your motive is to increase the economic density of transactions. So Lightning does that, right? But people need a reason to create an L2, like a roll up on Bitcoin or to use Lightning. The reason now is fees. So I don't really worry about it because all Ordinals does is create this motive for developers to increase the efficiency of the Bitcoin system in terms of the value to the bytes ratio. And we should always be increasing that ratio. I believed in that a long time. And there, in the last 2 years or so, there hasn't been a good reason to try and be efficient with your transactions because the block space was cheap. Now it's expensive. There's a good reason it'd be like that. And I think all Bitcoiners today believe in layered scaling, right? So ordinals being a thing increases fees, increases the need for layered scaling. So I do think it makes Bitcoin better at being money. It does dilute the narrative a little bit, for sure. So I think that's a valid complaint that people have. Like, Bitcoin should just be about financial transactions, but the benefits seem really material to me.
It's diluted the some of the core ideology as well, because there is certainly a split amongst people who consider themselves Bitcoin maximalists. We were out in I can't remember that bar, the PubKey event the other night, and that's a Bitcoin crowd. That is, a Bitcoin crowd was probably, I would guess, 95 to 99%, maybe even 100% would have been small blockers, would you say?
Yeah.
But I think it's a much wider split of those who are pro-ordinals and those who are against it. I'd be guessing 50.
I would take the other side of it. I think the vast majority of people I speak to just are pretty on the fence with it. They don't really care.
Well, they don't care, but the pros and the against, they're like, I've seen a fairly even split. But it's diluted that ideology, and sometimes I'm like, that's a good thing because we don't want ideologues here. But at the same time, I don't know when there comes a time when we do need the ideologues, where we've got the people who are firmly... Yeah, I always think of John Carvalho during the block size wars. I thought he did a very good job at defending on the Bitcoin mailing list, with others just like letting this pass. I don't know if there comes a time when we need it. But it's certainly split the crowd, and perhaps this is just going to keep happening. So there is no core thesis, and perhaps that's the best thing for this.
Well, I think one obvious thing, it brings more people into Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And it brings a different breed of person, and I'm always on the side of universalizing and as big tent as possible. So I think it makes Bitcoin more palatable, actually, to newcomers to see that there's heterogeneity in the community ideologically. The other interesting thing is it actually might help ossify Bitcoin in some sense, because the developers now realize there's unintended consequences of the changes they insert into Bitcoin. No Bitcoin core developer really realized that SegWit plus Taproot would equal inscriptions. So I think there's actually going to be some hesitancy in the core dev community to do another change, for better or for worse. And that means that Bitcoin is more likely to be ossified. And so I don't know if we actually need sort of the same foot soldiers that we had in the scaling wars, because I don't see any imminent changes on the horizon. In fact, I think it's actually quite possible that Taproot is maybe the last major change we get in Bitcoin, precisely because of the ordinals and inscription things. It makes the devs realize, wow, we tweaked this one small thing, had this huge, colossal effect, so let's not change anything ever again.